one way or the other, then, well, just suspend judgment on that. Let's put a pin in that one and come back to it until we have more evidence, until we can do more research, or maybe even the evidence isn't available. And so we have to suspend judgment on that. So let's just define argument. And an argument is a group of statements, one of which is supported by the rest. That being the conclusion, right? But that's the argument, group of reasons. And one of those, if you had 1, 2, 3, 4, and that fourth is the conclusion that's supported by the other 3. There's linkage, in other words. So there's a logical progression. They all link. It isn't like, which a lot of people do, here's this reason, that reason, this reason, and they have no coherence. They have no consistency. There's no compatibility between them all. They're all just, thrown all over the place. Say, there, I just gave you 20 reasons, but there was no logical progression from which to draw a conclusion. Premises, then, so argument of premises is a list of supporting statements, supporting the conclusion. The conclusion is the statement that's being supported. So an argument is not merely a list of reasons, as I said, for or against something. They must progress logically to the conclusion. And then in some cases you have a varying sense of certainty, right? Because maybe there just isn't enough evidence to support the conclusion, but there's enough evidence that you'd say, if I have to determine whether that's something worthy of belief or not, I simply lean in favor of believing it because there seems to be more evidence for it than against it, something like that. And some things in life, you can be that way. You can have a relative degree of certainty, not absolute. I mean, there's a lot of things that you don't have absolute certainty about, but that doesn't mean that I won't believe it unless I have absolute certainty. Okay, so just to understand the role of arguments relative to absolute certainty, and we'll get to it in a moment when we talk about deductive versus inductive arguments. Just like there's inductive and deductive Bible study, there's inductive and deductive reasoning, inductive and deductive arguments. So here's an argument. Argument 1, capital punishment is morally permissible. That's the conclusion. Okay, so we put that little C in there to indicate conclusion. The little P is premise. Because it helps to deter crime. So this is an argument basically put in one step, one bullet point. This is a very simple argument. If we invert it and we say capital punishment helps to deter crime, therefore it is morally permissible, right? So now that sounds more like an argument. A second argument, if John killed Bill in self-defense, now we're starting with a premise here. If John killed, this is an if-then argument. If John killed Bill in self-defense, he did not commit murder. That's one premise. The second premise, John acted in self-defense. Therefore, you see the form of the argument now? Therefore, John did not commit murder, the conclusion. All right, aside from this kind of gruesome example, could you at least note that you have 3 statements? 2 of them are premises. 1 is a conclusion. There can be a major premise, a minor premise that supports the first premise, the major premise, and then a conclusion. But then you'll notice that there's a logical progression, that the 2 premises link to the conclusion. How about a third argument? Telling a white lie is morally permissible. Wow, I'm not saying I agree with this. These are just examples, okay? So there's the conclusion. So we should judge the rightness of an act by its impact on human well-being. That's a premise. In other words, that's one reason. If an act increases human well-being, then it is right. And without question, telling a white lie increases human well-being because it spares people's feelings. That's what white lies are for, right? There are so many problems with this argument, but I am just showing you how there is a logical progression from the premises to a conclusion. Now, just in this simple argument, as it's stated, you'd have to prove these things, right? And so remember, I said, wow, not only do you have to have reasons, but they have to be good reasons, and they're only good reasons if there's evidence to support them. So, how do you know that a white lie increases human well-being? Within what parameters of time? You know, how do you not know that the accumulation of white lies are going to damage your own reputation with this person or group of people that, do you really want to be known as the person? Yeah, I just lied to you actually because I wanted to spare your feelings. Do you really want to be known as that person? Of course, you don't want to be known as this person that just speaks everything that's in their mind. We all know those folks. You know, they're just so outspoken, we would say. Nonetheless, we'd have to question the whole idea about what do you mean by well-being? And sometimes you have to do this, when you're having a moral discussion with someone. Well, let's talk about well-being. What do you even mean when you say that? And how do you know that this, in the long run, does not turn out to be more damaging? It's a consequentialist type of argument here, which are just not good arguments. So arguments can vary dramatically in the number of premises, those statements. Some even have multiple conclusions as well, and so on, and the wording of those and all of this. So the pattern is what makes an argument an argument. So let's talk about non-argumentative prose. Our arguments are not always as easily identified. If you're reading prose, that is, you're reading a book, you're reading somebody offer a narrative or sort of an ongoing discussion about something, they don't follow the strict bullet-pointed statements or premises and conclusion. But you have to do the critical thinking to find what statements are in fact premises. In other words, as you're reading through this, wait a minute, and you underline. Maybe use different colors, but you underline it. Ooh, hey, there's a claim right there. There's a claim. I found a claim. Now I need to find, is there any place that they back that claim or support that claim with another claim or with evidence? Where's the evidence? You're looking through this to find, and then out of that, it might be an entire chapter where, and I've written, this way, whether it's a journal article, whether it's a book, and I'll state at the beginning of the chapter that basically this is what the chapter is intended to prove. This is how I will prove it. And as a matter of fact, I will have students, I'm not sure if I'm doing it in this class or not, but I have students that I will say, read the book critically. That is to tell me, for each chapter, what is the author's thesis and what evidence does the author provide to support that thesis? Did the author effectively present an argument that leads to a conclusion? So properly speaking, right in the introduction, blah, 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 here's my thesis, here's how I'm going to prove what I intend to prove by the evidence. Then there's the presentation of the evidence, and then the conclusion, right? So I know you might think in a lot of books, like, well, I hit the conclusion, so skip over that, what difference, but the conclusion is an actual conclusion, which means that conclusion should point back to help you understand, at the outset of this chapter, I presented this thesis. I also said I would present this evidence. I presented that evidence. I presented to you reasons why I support this evidence over detractors of this particular points of view. I pointed out 3 various opposing arguments to my thesis and proved why my thesis accounts for and is superior to, all of this, right? Therefore, the conclusion stands. But it's up to you, to the reader, to say, I don't know. I didn't know. Now, I don't think your second premise was all that well supported. I think you need to do a little bit more work in that. That's taking this kind of critical approach. Or what will happen invariably with students is they'll write, and then in the conclusion, they're offering things in the conclusion that have no linkage to anything that they wrote in the paper. And a lot of that just can be, not a lot of experience writing, research or technical types of papers. Or it can be that they're just importing another source and putting it in the conclusion that has no linkage to anything else in the paper. The farther you go in your studies, and even if you get into graduate level work, the more the scrutiny on this type. So I can supervise, at this point, I supervise doctoral students, which means I'm looking at their major dissertation or research work, and I can find a lot of logical inconsistencies and so on. It's fairly common because this is how we are, It's fairly common for someone to just put all kinds of reasons into something, but yet not logically connect them and support them by evidence such that their conclusion is valid and that conclusion has been properly tested. What do I mean by that? How many opposing viewpoints did you include in your work such that your conclusion, your thesis, has been properly tested? So I hope this makes some sense, because it can really revolutionize how you read books. It can revolutionize how you talk to people. It can revolutionize how you evaluate the claims that people will make. It can revolutionize how you do your own research and so on. So an example of a non-argumentative prose: the number of abortions performed in this state is increasing. More and more women say that they favor greater access to abortion. This is an outrage. We'd say, is this technically an argument? No. Why? Because, there's no premise stated to base a conclusion. It's not there. What we see is 2 assertions of fact and an expression of indignation. Right? That's exactly what we see. But how about a modified example? The number of abortions performed in the state is increasing. That's a premise. And more women say they favor greater access to abortion. That's a premise. Therefore, in this state, the trend among women is towards greater acceptance of abortion. Conclusion. Well, now what you've done is you have presented this author's claims in such a way to expose properly the writer's attitude about and say bias towards abortion, right? And also at the same time you expose the writer's attitude, you expose the unsupported claims that are made. And so we end up with a much longer passage piled high with more assertions, but with no argument in sight. And you're going to find that in this whole moral universe and spectrum of moral positions, that many are made without valid reasons. Many are made that are not representing any kind of statements in a logical form, in the form of an argument. And if they're not, they're just saying, I'm outraged that women cannot have abortion. I'm outraged by this. But outrage doesn't mean true. And what we're after is the truth. Remember, give reasons. And give good reasons, because the good reasons are based on evidence, and good evidence is based on truth. And anything apart from that is merely somebody espousing their, remember the word, preference? Because you prefer that women should have abortions doesn't make it morally appropriate that they do. And so, I don't want to overstate it because I think you get it. So distinguishing arguments from non-argumentative prose. So we have to pay attention to what are called indicator words. And indicator words are terms that often appear in arguments, and they signal that a premise is either nearby or a conclusion is forthcoming. So you look for these terms. You look for them in your reading. You take note of what the author is stating. Whether where's the premise? Is there a premise coming, or are they offering a conclusion? So the word "therefore" is an indicator word, and it indicates that a conclusion follows. Obviously, you see the word "therefore." Oh, here comes a conclusion. Or the word "because" signals the beginning of a preference. Because of this, then we conclude this, something of that particular nature. So probably the most reliable way to identify arguments is to always look for the conclusion first. And when you know what claim is being supported, you can more easily see what statements are doing the support. If somebody's just dropping conclusions all over the place, they're unsubstantiated, they're unsupported, you need to call them on that and say, well, don't do it in an aggressive or antagonistic way, but do it more in an inquisitive way and say, that's interesting. What you just said right there. You said that so conclusively. So I'm curious, what is your evidence? And if the evidence is, well, because I think, because I think, or because I feel, well, that then that's just a matter of preference. But if someone says, well, because I know this, then you follow it up. You follow up with a claim to knowledge. Now, I know you follow that claim to knowledge up with something like, how do you know that? I'd just be interested. Did you read that somewhere? Do you have any kind of evidence to support that? So a true statement always has something to prove. If there's no statement that the writer is trying to convince you to accept, no argument is present, and you need not look further. Let's talk about persuasion for just a moment. And how is persuasion at all involved? Because listen, some people can be very, very, very persuasive. I can remember some years ago being in the Ukraine, had a group of Polish nationals with me because I've been working in Poland for about 30 years. And so because they're also fluent in Russian, we went into the Ukraine and began evangelizing. Had an American student with me as well, very committed believer. And I remember after one service, she says, wow, if I wasn't already a believer, I would have come forward myself. So, persuasion, right? But we're all around people that are very, very persuasive. But is it because they're persuasive that they're also true? Now, both of those, sure, they could go together. Somebody, as a matter of fact, I become more and more passionate or more persuasive based on how convinced I am. But just because I'm convinced doesn't mean that I've presented the evidence to support my statements in such a way that you should be convinced. If it's just mere persuasion, and I'm telling stories and I'm giving examples, of things like this, that's just persuasion. So where does that fit in? Well, we'll define it as influencing another by any number of means. Okay, so you could persuade somebody properly with evidence and facts, but what if it's just emotional appeals, or you're using kind of rhetorical devices, or you're deceiving someone, or there's propaganda. You know, if you're in a war and one army wants to convince the other army of something, you use deception commonly, or you use propaganda, and everyone is in retreat on your side or something. But people can be convinced to believe or to do many things. That is without good reason. So good reasons are those things, as we said, are supported by good evidence, and good evidence is that which comports with what is true and what is completely true. There's a lot of half-truth that we have to be careful of. And we know that this is so common. A bunch of half-truths to persuade you or to convince you of something, but yet it's the whole truth that would prove that which you've been persuaded to do is in fact not in your best interest at all. So reasoned argument does not necessarily play any part at all in persuasion. That is to say, you may be able to use some of these ploys to persuade people to believe a claim, but if you articulate a good argument, then you prove something, and others might be persuaded by your reasoning. I mean, there isn't a lot of excitement, in just presenting the facts without all of the other gesturing and raising of the voice and all of that, just the facts. And in life, a lot of times, you're just stepping back and using reason, not emotion, but reason to determine what is true or not. Sometimes true doesn't rise to the level of emotional excitement. It may be a fact that's a very difficult fact to accept, but you accept it not because it makes you feel better, you accept it because it's true. And your ultimate well-being is grounded not in how you feel, but in what is true. Something could feel right in the next 10 minutes, in the next hour, that could feel right today, but ultimately be proved to be dangerous, vicious, harmful, and completely against your well-being tomorrow or a week from now.